Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at Old Testament narrative in our continuing study of hermeneutics. Literary theory has suggested that narrative can offer a more powerful medium of truth than just a statement of propositions. We're used to, especially us in the West, are used to the propositional statements. Um, we give a series of attributes of God. God is infinite and eternal in his wisdom and his justice and his goodness and his holiness and all these different things. And those are true. That's a very Western way of looking at it. But in the East, it's more common to tell stories to learn about God. Now, why would that be the case? Because stories take us into the story. We we find ourselves not just saying, "Okay, that's a nice lesson over there," but we find ourselves as participants in the story. Now, this brings up the question, should we look to construct our theology today on the basis of stories? I do think we have to take care, but at the very least, we can say that the stories help us to illustrate that theology and help us to more fully understand that theology. And that means that God, when we see him as the character in the narratives, remember that God is the hero. Oftentimes when you are reading or seeing a story on a movie or something like that, you're looking for that hero in the character. And the heroes in the Bible, they're very broken heroes unless we recognize that God is the main hero, that he is the character, he's the hero of the narrative. Now, take for example Genesis chapter 2, beginning in verse 16. We're going to uh, present what is, for some, I think, a problem. Let's read it, where God has made mankind, and the Lord God commanded the man, saying, "From any tree of the garden you may eat freely, but from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat from it, you shall surely die." Notice the promise there. Now, we're not really focusing on prophecy, but there is a prophecy here. Notice how it's worded. In the day that you eat from it, you shall surely die. And this brings up the question, ate from it. You know the story. The serpent shows up, and there's a temptation, and the woman eats, and then the man she gives to the man, and he eats with her. And the temptation there is you're going to be like God. And of course, there's a sense in which that took place because God had. But the point is that God had already made man in His own image. He didn't need to be like God because God had already made him in certain ways like God. Now, here's the where the temptation takes place and comes to, excuse the pun, to fruition when the woman saw that the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes and that the tree was desirable to make one wise. She took from its fruit and ate, and she gave also to her husband with her, and he ate. And then we read, the eyes of both of them were opened, and they knew that they were naked, and they sewed fig leaves together and made themselves loin coverings. This brings up the question, why didn't they die? The promise had been on the day they eat from it, they will certainly die. And they didn't. Now, in trying to deal with that question, people have said, and they're taking this from the New Testament. The New Testament does speak about spiritual death. For example, in Ephesians chapter 2, verse 1, it says, "You were all dead in in your trespasses and sins, in which you formerly walked according to the course of the world," and so on. Is this speaking of spiritual death? And I hear many Christians give that answer. Yes, they died spiritually that day. And let me just say, theologically, I agree that they did die spiritually, but I don't think that's how we are to understand Genesis chapters 2 and 3, because spiritual death is nowhere in the context. It's not until I get to the New Testament that I read about this idea of spiritual death. It's true. Yeah, they did die spiritually, but that's not how we are to understand and interpret Genesis chapters 2 and 3. So instead, notice when we get to Genesis chapter 5, and all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. And we go on to read, about Seth, and we go on actually through that entire genealogy. And he died, and he died, and he died, and he died, and it takes us through the entire section, um, and death nowhere there is spiritual. It's all physical death, and he died. And so the question is, but why didn't they die in the garden? And I think there is an answer. Answer is in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 21. The context, it's always the context where we find the answer. The Lord God made garments of skin for Adam and his wife and clothed them. Now, our Jewish readers, even going back to before Jesus came along, they looked at this and they understood, wait a second, sacrifices, garments of skin that would take an animal dying. And so they saw the death there as a substitute, as the first sacrifice where an animal died in their place. And so why didn't they die? Because a substitute died in their place. And I think that's a better way of understanding hermeneutically Genesis chapter 3, the promise in chapter 2, and then the fulfillment or lack thereof. I don't think there's lack thereof. I think this is the fulfillment in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 21. And so this is, now from a New Testament perspective, this is pointing to Jesus because he is the garments of skin. He came. The New Testament teaches how you are all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus. For all of you who were baptized into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. So we see a New Testament application, but I could get the sense of that even before I had the greater revelation of the New Testament. I could get the sacrificial idea. And our Jewish friends did get that idea from just reading Genesis chapters 1, 2, and 3, and they were supposed to. So, when we talk about you're all sons of God through faith in Christ Jesus, he is the ultimate fulfillment. We're going to talk about ultimate fulfillments in just a moment. He is the ultimate fulfillment of that. But I see in the sacrificial atonement, that is the lamb that died in their place, I see that as an immediate fulfillment of this passage. Now, let's go on. Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15. I have another promise, and this is after God shows up and they've eaten and they've tried the fig leaves, and that God shows up and he gives this promise: I will put enmity, speaking to the serpent now, between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. He shall bruise you on the head, and you shall bruise him on the heel. And again, people ask, of what is that speaking? And so you've got this promise about the seed of the serpent and the seed of the woman, and they look ultimately from a New Testament perspective again, that the seed of the serpent, they identify that with Satan. Remember how the New Testament speaks about how that old serpent, the devil, Genesis chapter 12, and about how he was a liar from the beginning. Jesus says that there's a sense in which his head was bruised on the cross, and that was a fatal wound. And then the seed of the woman, ultimately speaking, is Jesus, who is heel, as usually said, the heel of his humanity was bruised on the cross. The idea is that the seed of the serpent, his defeat was eternal, but the defeat of Jesus, if I can call it a defeat, on the cross, that was just temporary, because then he rose again from the dead. That works, again, theologically from a New Testament perspective, but I don't think that's what you're supposed to immediately see when you read Genesis in its context. So I'm not saying that's not true. I think it is true. But I think that we're supposed to see something before we see that in the context of Genesis. What is it that we are to see? Well, you read the next chapter, and you have Cain and Abel. Remember that they are born to Adam and Eve. But then Cain, in his actions, remember, he kills Abel, and he acts not like that promise, but he acts like the serpent. He acts like the enemy. Notice I haven't used the word Satan. I'm not saying Satan was there, but he hasn't been revealed yet. And so Cain is acting in a way that sounds like, spiritually speaking, I'm not even sure if I want to say it quite that way, but that he's following in the footsteps of the serpent. And of course, what do I have next? I have an entire seed. So Cain kills his brother, and of course Seth is given as a replacement. But then I go from Cain 7 generations down to Lamech, who also kills somebody and then writes a song to talk about it. And then chapter 5 of Genesis, I can't go to Abel anymore. He's died. But Seth is now given as a replacement. And now I'm going to go 7 generations down, and I'll get to Enoch. He doesn't kill anyone. Instead, he walks with God. The idea that you've read that formula, and he died, and he died, and he died. And you get to Enoch, and it says, and he was not. In other words, he didn't die, but that instead he walks with God. But it doesn't stop there. It continues going, that seed of the woman idea, all the way down to Noah. And of course, the flood comes and takes everyone away except Noah and his family. And then you find out that Noah has a promised seed. There's Shem, but there's also one in the story that acts in an improper way. This is at the end of Genesis chapter 9. His name is Ham. But it's not Ham that's cursed. Instead, it is Ham's descendant, Canaan. Not all of Ham's descendants are cursed, but Canaan is, who comes into the story at the end of Genesis, because the land of Canaan is going to be promised to Abraham. You see how this fits the story of Genesis and the Torah. And then from Shem, I keep going down, all the way down to Abraham, and the story continues to and through Abraham, all the way down to Isaac and Jacob and Joseph and so on. And so I come to Abraham, and of course, Abraham has Isaac, but Abraham has another son too. It's not that he's a bad person or anything like that, but that he's not the son of the promise. And so there's this idea, not that he's a terrible person at all, but that he's an alternate Ishmael. This, in a sense, I don't want to say anything bad about him, but he's cast out again, like the serpent is cast out, like the serpent is cursed. And then the promise goes down from Isaac to Jacob. And of course, Jacob is one of two sons because there's also Esau. And Esau is the son he's going to be cast out too. He's going to be rejected. I'm not saying Jacob was a better person. He actually wasn't. We're going to look a little bit at the story of Jacob. I think the thing you're supposed to ask at the end of Genesis is, whose seed are you? And whose seed do you resemble? Are you following the promised seed? Are you holding on to that? Or are you going and doing your own thing? So Genesis chapter 3 and verse 16, going back to Genesis 3, to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children. Now notice how this is set almost in stanzas. This is poetry. This is a song, and when you have poetry, remember, you have to have parallelism. So what I have here is synonymous parallelism, where to the woman he said, I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you will bring forth children. Those are two lines that are saying the same thing. Just like when we looked at the parallelism of the Psalms, of the poets of poetry in Hebrew. You say it, and then you say it the same thing, but in slightly different words, and that's what we have here. But then the next two lines, notice the next two lines, yet your desire will be for your husband, and he will rule over you. That, I would suggest, seems to be antithetical parallelism. Your desire will be for your husband. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? It's just a thing. And he will rule over you. So there's something about this. Is it at odds? Is it antithetical? Is it synonymous? It's certainly not synonymous. But notice, and people have puzzled over that. Well, what does it mean about he will rule over you? Well, the he will rule over you, that part is easy, because husbands have historically ruled over wives, and sometimes in a very strong and I don't want to say the word necessarily violent, but yes, sometimes it's even turned violent, and in something of what I guess can be described as sort of an oppressive way. And yet, notice, yet your desire will be for your husband. In spite of that, all throughout history, women have still wanted husbands. Have you noticed that? Husbands aren't always that great to have. And yet, women have continued throughout most of history, have continued to want husbands. Now, finishing up this section, Genesis 3 and verse 17, then to Adam he said, because you've listened to the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree about which I commanded you, saying, you shall not eat from it. And here, now we switch to the poetry. Cursed is the ground because of you. In toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. Actually, there's three lines, not two. But it's all saying sort of the same idea and building upon it. And then verses 18 and 19, both thorns and thistles it shall grow for you, and you will eat the plants of the field. Notice that's saying the same thing, those two lines. Verse 19, by the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground. That's finishing the thought. So you're going to eat the bread. It's going to be difficult, sweat of your face. You'll return to the ground. And then by explanation, because from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you shall return. Actually, that's three lines, but that's okay. That still works. And it's finishing the thought that's been presented. Finally, I want to jump down. I want to jump down and look at the life of Jacob. This is the Jacob story, the narrative of Jacob, and the interesting way in which it is presented. You have in Genesis chapter 25, the birth of the twins, and remember, both Esau and Jacob are named. I could have put Jacob and Esau are named, but I'm only focusing on Jacob because there's going to be some repetition in the story. So Jacob is named, and of course he's named Jacob because he comes out, he's holding onto his brother's heel, Esau's heel, and that carries a connotation in the ancient world. We have a similar sort of connotation. We say where somebody is pulling your leg. And we don't mean that literally. He says, he's pulling my leg. That's actually a figure of speech to say he's trying to sort of pull one over on me. He's maybe trying to trick me or something like that. And they had that idea back then, although it had more of a negative idea to grab someone's heel, a heel grabber, or just calling somebody a heel. That's to deceive. So he's named heel. That's what the word Yaakov means. It means heel or deceiver. And then there's a little interlude where Rebecca, the camera goes to her for a chapter. She's taken to the foreign palace. It's one of those, she's not my wife, she's my sister stories, just like we would see with Abraham and Sarah. But at the end, it turns out okay, and she's restored to Isaac, and there's a pact with them, and everything's okay. I mention it because, again, we're going to have some repetition. The story goes back now to Jacob, who has already conned his brother Esau out of his birthright, but now he steals the family blessing. And remember the story where Jacob dresses up in an Esau costume and he puts goat hair over him, something that comes back later in the Genesis story about garments with goats and things like that. But Esau finds out about it and says, well, I'm going to kill Jacob. And Jacob takes off and he's going to relocate to Haran. And he's on his way there when Jacob has an encounter with God, has a vision of a ladder. So he has an encounter with God, and God gives him promises. And God says, go ahead and go, and I will go with you to that foreign land, and I will bring you back. So great promises there. And he arrives in Haran, and there he meets not Rebecca, he meets Rachel, and it's love at first sight. And so he arranges with Rachel's father to work for her. And he does marry her, but actually Laban cons Jacob. Jacob's Jacob. He cheats him, and Jacob first marries Leah, but then finally the deal is, well, you can also have Rachel too. So he ends up with two not for the price of one, two for the price of two. And then chapters 29 and 30, where now that he has these two wives, they are fertile, and not just them, but also their handmaidens that they're using as substitutes to try to hurry up the process and have lots of children. And so Jacob now has a number of children by both Leah, and initially not Rachel, but by Rachel's handmaiden, and then by Leah's handmaiden, and finally by Rachel as well. So the wives are fertile. And then Jacob is continuing to work for his father-in-law for the flocks, and there's a deal there that Laban is, again, trying to cheat him. And Jacob does some trickery too, but God blesses all of it. And Jacob's flocks are fertile, and at the end, Jacob ends up with all of Laban's flocks. And so now he's afraid that Laban is going to come after him, and so he runs away from Haran. He's running back to Canaan. And he runs, and Laban chases him down. There's this whole story there that takes place. I'm not going to go into the details. But now as he comes back into the land and he hears that Esau is coming to meet him, and he's worried about that, and Jacob has another encounter with God. And it's this midnight wrestling match. So notice how we had an encounter with God with the vision of the ladder. Now we have another encounter with God. This time, and Jacob is given that new name, Israel, because you have Israel with El, because you have wrestled with God. And so Jacob has this other encounter with God. And then after that, Jacob has his encounter with Esau, who he had feared, but it turns out okay, and there's a reunion between the two. And now that they're back in the land, there is another interlude where now it's Dinah, the daughter of Jacob, who's just barely been mentioned. She's in a foreign palace now. And again, there's a pact with the foreigners, but it doesn't turn out good. This turns out with the slaughter of all the foreigners, those that are living in Shechem. Notice there's an interlude in each story, and the entire Jacob narrative ends. Now, doesn't mean Jacob's died; he's still alive, but the scene will shift now to Joseph. But it ends with the death of Rebekah's nurse, and also you're going to see eventually Rachel die as well. But it ends where Jacob, you actually have the statement in chapter 35 that Jacob's name is changed to Israel. And you say, wait a minute, I thought it was already changed back in chapter 32. It was, but you have this repetition. You say, why would it be repeated? Because you have to fit the design where Jacob was named at the beginning of the story. He must be named again, even though you've seen earlier how it took place, but he must be named again at the end to give balance to the story. And that explains why I see certain parts of the story repeated. Now, sometimes it's a repetition, sometimes it's just a similar event, but here it was a repetition. He had been named, and you see him named again. It's the same name, nothing's changed, but it's repeated because you have to give balance to the story. And so when you're trying to figure out why is this repeated, why is this order like this, sometimes it's to give balance to the narrative. This whole format is known as a chiastic telling. The word key is the one of the Greek letters. Sort of like instead of going 0.1234, you go 0.12 and then 0.21. This is a much larger one. It's 0.1234, and then 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Notice in this case there was no central big idea in the middle. They were in parallel as well. Sometimes in a chiasm, you look for what's the middle, sort of the middle point, that's the fulcrum for the whole story. In this case, it's not so much a fulcrum. Maybe it is, but I don't really see it that way. But rather, it's showing the parallelism, the same sort of parallelism that we saw in lines in poetry. Now we see in entire events. Here in Genesis, but it's not limited to Genesis. You see it in Exodus and Leviticus. You see it later on in the historical books as well. And so this becomes an interpretive key to better understanding the layout of the Old Testament narratives.